My name is Rachel Miller. I am 30 years old, and the night my brother snapped my fingers, one by one, I realized family could be more dangerous than any stranger on the street. His hand clamped around mine with a force that felt inhuman, and before I could breathe, he bent my index finger back until the bone cracked like dry wood splitting in a fire. The sound was sharp, final, and my scream tore through the room only to be swallowed by the walls. Pain shot up my arm in a burning wave. My vision blurred, and I gasped as if the air itself had abandoned me. He did not stop. His eyes locked on mine wide with rage and satisfaction, and he whispered through clenched teeth that I would never rise above him. My middle finger went next. He moved slower this time, bending it back with deliberate cruelty so I felt every tendon stretch until the bone shattered. I howled a sound closer to an animal than a woman, and my knees buckled under the weight of agony. My brother pressed me to the floor, his knee crushing my shoulder, his breath hot and rancid against my ear. He said he wanted me broken, that he wanted my dreams destroyed, that every snap of bone was proof he controlled me. I begged, sobbing, clawing at the carpet until my nails ripped and blood streaked across the floorboards. But my voice was nothing a pitiful rasp drowned out by his laughter. Then came the ring finger. The crack rang out like a gunshot, and I felt the world spin spots of light exploding before my eyes as my body convulsed with pain. Tears poured down my face, but I refused to give him the sign of surrender. He leaned closer and hissed that I was weak, that no one would save me, that our parents would believe him just as they always had. The fourth finger bent with a sickening crunch, and I thought dimly that I was watching my life shatter piece by piece, every broken joint another stolen chance at freedom. My throat burned from screaming. My chest heaved with sobs that rattled my ribs, and still he laughed. He reached for my thumb with a steady calm that terrified me more than his rage. In that moment, I understood he would not stop until I was ruined, until I could never hold a pen, never cradle a child, never touch the life I had fought so hard to build. My heart pounded, blood roared in my ears, and a thought seared through the haze of pain. If I gave up now, he would win forever. Survival meant fighting with what little strength I had left. My brother's grip tightened, but so did my resolve, and in that instant of unbearable pain, I swore I would not let him take the last piece of me. When the sound of my last scream still hung in the air, the door opened and my parents appeared, but instead of rushing to me, they rushed to him. My brother let go of my hand and immediately clutched his own arm, dragging his nails across his skin to raise red marks. Then he fell to the floor and began to sob. My mother dropped to her knees beside him, crying out his name, while my father glared at me with the same cold disappointment that had shadowed my entire life. I was crumpled against the wall, my mangled hand pressed to my chest, every finger swollen and twisted, my voice broken from screaming. I tried to tell them what he had done, but only a rasp came out, and they did not want to hear it. My mother brushed hair from his forehead and whispered that he must have been terrified. My brother's voice cracked with practiced anguish as he shouted that I had attacked him first, that I had gone crazy, that he was only defending himself. He pointed at the scratches on his arm and wailed that I had tried to ruin him. The words hit me harder than the fractures because they were familiar. The same lies he had always spun and the same lies my parents had always believed. My father barked my name, his voice sharp with disgust, and told me to stop this nonsense. He said I had always been jealous, that I had always looked for ways to make myself a victim. My mother's eyes wet with false tears, for her son turned to me with pure disdain as she said I should be ashamed for making up such a story. I tried again, lifting my trembling hand to show the broken fingers, but my father only muttered that I had probably done it to myself to frame my brother. The betrayal sliced deeper than the pain radiating up my arm. My brother sat in their arms, smirking through his tears, his face half hidden against my mother's shoulder, and when their eyes shifted away, he looked directly at me and mouthed that I deserved it. My stomach lurched, and I nearly vomited from the mix of pain and disbelief. Every nerve in my body screamed for comfort, but none came. My parents guided him to the couch, wrapped a blanket around him, poured him a glass of water, and whispered assurances that everything would be fine. Not one of them reached for me. I lay on the floor, gasping for air. My hand, a grotesque shape of bruises and swelling, and realized they saw me not as their daughter, but as an inconvenience. My father eventually ordered me to my room, his voice tight with anger, saying that if I could not control myself, then I should stay out of sight. My mother nodded in agreement, stroking my brother's hair as if he were a wounded child. He whimpered for effect, and they cooed over him. I stumbled to my feet, every step agony, my hand hanging useless at my side. My body shaking with sobs I tried to swallow. As I passed them, my brother looked up, his eyes gleaming with triumph, and gave the smallest nod as though to confirm that he had won. My parents saw nothing, or rather they chose not to see, because to them I had always been the problem, never him. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my hand throbbing with every beat of my heart, and I understood with terrifying clarity that my suffering meant nothing to them. They would protect him no matter what. The injustice was complete, the gaslighting perfect, and I was left alone with the knowledge that in this house I would never be believed. When I think back to how it all began, the night of broken fingers feels less like an isolated act of cruelty and more like the inevitable conclusion of a life lived in the shadow of favoritism and neglect. I was born 4 years after my brother Daniel, and from the first moments of my childhood, it was clear that he was the golden child. At family gatherings, relatives gushed over his every word, his every accomplishment, no matter how small. When he learned to ride a bike, my parents threw a party and filmed every wobbling push of the pedals. When I won first place in a spelling bee at school, my father barely looked up from his newspaper, and my mother simply told me not to brag. The message was planted early. Daniel was extraordinary, I was ordinary, and no matter how hard I tried, I would never measure up. That truth grew like mold through the years, staining every memory. Birthdays for him meant balloons and cakes layered with frosting, expensive gifts, and sleepovers with dozens of kids from the neighborhood. For me, it meant store-bought cakes with my name spelled wrong, a single wrapped sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs, and a reminder to be grateful for what I got. At Christmas, he unwrapped the newest video game consoles while I received hand-me-down clothes that had once been his. My mother would shake her head at me if I dared to look disappointed and tell me I was too demanding, that I should learn to share. In school, the differences widened. Daniel struggled to keep up with his classes, often coming home with poor grades or detention slips. Yet my parents always defended him, insisting that his teachers were unfair, that he was misunderstood. They hired tutors, they spent hours at the table helping him, they assured him that he was smart. Meanwhile, I studied late into the night, aced every exam, won ribbons at science fairs, but my efforts were greeted with silence. When I tried to show them my report cards, my father muttered that, of course, I did well, that it was expected of me. Praise was reserved for Daniel. Disappointment was reserved for me. By the time I entered high school, I had stopped expecting fairness. I poured myself into my studies not for their approval, but for survival. I worked after-school shifts at a local diner scrubbing dishes until my fingers blistered, saving every dollar in a jar hidden beneath my bed. My dream was simple but powerful. I wanted to become a nurse to help people who had no one else because I knew too well what it felt like to be invisible. That dream carried me through exhaustion, through nights when I cried quietly, so no one would hear, through mornings when my mother compared me unfavorably to Daniel before I had even left for school. He was loud, charming, reckless. I was quiet, diligent, forgettable. He basked in attention. I was scolded for asking questions. Even as children, we were not allies. Daniel discovered early that he could use his favored status as a weapon. If he broke a vase, he pointed at me and said, "I did it." If he wanted a toy, he snatched it from my hands, and when I cried, my mother scolded me for not sharing. If he failed a test, he said I refused to help him study and I was punished for being selfish. Every injustice left scars that were invisible but deep. My father's silence, my mother's favoritism, Daniel's cruelty, all of it pressed down on me until I felt like a ghost wandering through my own home. Yet even in that darkness, there were glimmers of light. My grandfather, my father's father, lived a few blocks away, and unlike my parents, he noticed me. He would make tea and listen as I rambled about school projects, about books I was reading, about my dream of nursing. He called me his little survivor and told me I had a strength that was steady, the kind that lasted. Those words were an anchor, and when he died of a heart attack when I was 16, it felt like the only person who truly saw me had vanished. Still, I carried his memory. In college, I found other fragments of support. A professor in my nursing program offered me a research position and mentored me with kindness. A classmate named David became my closest friend and later my partner. He listened when I told him about the imbalance at home, about how Daniel twisted everything, about how my parents believed him without question. He was the first to say the word abuse out loud. Abuse is not just bruises, he told me, it is neglect. It is being silenced. It is being blamed for what others do to you. Hearing it defined shook me, but it also gave me clarity. The cycle I was trapped in was not normal. It was violence in disguise. Even with those lights guiding me, I still returned home on weekends, still sat at the dinner table where my mother criticized me, where my father stared past me, where Daniel bragged about his shallow accomplishments. I told myself that maybe if I kept trying, they would see me, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was never meant to shine in that house. I was there to serve as contrast to Daniel, to carry blame so he could carry glory. The memory that haunts me most came when I was 10 years old and burning with fever so high I could barely move. I begged my mother to take me to a hospital, but she said Daniel had a basketball game and we could not miss it. She tucked a blanket around me and left me sweating and shivering on the couch while they drove away to cheer for him. That night, I learned I could be on the edge of collapse and still be invisible. Those moments etched themselves into me. They explained why at 30 years old, I still found myself caught in the same poisonous web. Family was supposed to protect, but mine used love as a weapon, loyalty as a leash, and favoritism as a shield for Daniel's violence. The broken fingers were not an accident of adulthood. They were the culmination of decades of cruelty and silence that had been condoned and encouraged since the day I was born. Despite the years of neglect and favoritism that defined my childhood, I refused to surrender completely to the role of a shadow. By the time I entered adulthood, I had realized that if my family could not value me, then I would have to carve value for myself. That realization did not come in a single revelation, but through long nights spent working, studying, and reminding myself that every small victory mattered even if no one at home noticed. In high school, while Daniel coasted through adolescence with my parents funding every whim, I worked shifts at the diner on weekends, stocked shelves at the pharmacy during summers, and babysat for neighbors late into the night. I came home exhausted with grease staining my shirt and blisters on my feet, but every dollar tucked into my savings jar was proof that I was building something of my own. My parents never asked how I managed, never cared that I left the house before dawn and returned after dark. They were too busy paying for Daniel's new clothes, his new phone, his endless drama. But I noticed the way those long hours toughened me, the way being dismissed fueled me instead of breaking me. School became my battlefield. While Daniel barely passed his classes, I pushed myself relentlessly, staying up until midnight, completing assignments, reading textbooks, memorizing every detail. I graduated near the top of my class, earned a scholarship to a state university, and stood on stage alone. My parents absent because they were at one of Daniel's minor competitions. I remember holding my diploma, smiling for a camera held by a friend's mother, and realizing that though my parents refused to see me, the world outside could. At university, I chose nursing not only for stability, but because I wanted meaning. I had known what it felt like to be neglected, to have pain ignored, and I swore that if I could ease the suffering of others, then my own suffering would not have been for nothing. My professors noticed my determination. I volunteered for extra clinical shifts, asked endless questions, and worked nights as a caregiver to pay rent. My classmates went to parties while I studied until my eyes burned. There were nights I cried from exhaustion, but each time I thought of Daniel sleeping comfortably in his old bedroom, while my mother folded his laundry, I pushed harder. Slowly, I built armor out of quiet victories. When a professor praised my diligence, I held the words close, even if I could not share them at home. When I earned a small grant, I used it for textbooks and refused to mention it at the dinner table because I knew it would be twisted into another reason for Daniel to resent me. With every step, I learned that independence was not granted, it was seized. And though my family could not understand, I became my own savior. Still, there were allies who reminded me that I was not invisible. My grandfather's memory guided me when I faltered his words about strength, steadying me through dark hours. A professor named Mrs. Henderson noticed my compassion and offered me mentorship. Most of all, David, the classmate who became my partner, provided support that was gentle and unconditional. He celebrated my small wins, brought me coffee during long nights, held my hand when exhaustion broke me. Unlike Daniel, he did not see my ambition as a threat. Unlike my parents, he did not resent my independence. He named what was happening to me as abuse, and that naming gave me clarity. Abuse was not only bruises, it was the silence, the dismissal, the refusal to protect. Knowing that gave me power because it meant I was not crazy for feeling wounded. As years passed, I began to dream of leaving completely, of building a life across the country where their voices could no longer reach me. I dreamed of standing in a hospital ward wearing scrubs, of holding the hands of patients who felt invisible and telling them they mattered. Those dreams were fragile, but they carried me through every insult, every glare of disappointment at the dinner table. They gave me a reason to endure until I could escape. But escape was never simple. I still returned home for holidays, still tried to please them despite knowing it was futile. Walking away entirely from your family is harder than it sounds, and I clung to hope that maybe one day they would see me for who I was. Deep down, though, I understood the truth. My place in that house was never secure. I was the scapegoat, the afterthought, the expendable one. My independence only made Daniel angrier and my parents colder. Yet that independence was my quiet rebellion, my proof that even in a house that tried to erase me, I could create worth of my own. The spark that ignited the night of shattered bones began over money, but at its core, it was about power. I had returned home for a short weekend carrying textbooks and exhaustion after a week of clinical rotations, hoping foolishly for a few hours of peace. Daniel was already there sprawled on the couch as if he still lived in the house permanently. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes disheveled, and I could smell the faint trace of alcohol even from across the room. He launched into a tirade about how unfair his boss was, how his coworkers were jealous, how he deserved more respect. My mother nodded with sympathy. My father grunted in agreement, and I remained silent, pushing food around my plate. Then Daniel said he needed a break, maybe even a trip to Vegas with friends to blow off steam, but he could not afford it. He tilted his head and looked at me with a smirk that told me what was coming. My mother's eyes brightened with an idea she had clearly been harboring, and she turned to me with a voice sweet as honey. "Rachel, you have always been responsible with money. Maybe you could help your brother. He has been under so much stress it would mean the world to him." My jaw clenched. The money I had saved was not for vacations or gambling. It was for tuition for rent, for the fragile independence I was building with every aching hour of work. I shook my head and said quietly but firmly, "No, I need that money for school." The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel's face darkened instantly. His lips curled into a sneer as he spat that I was selfish that I would let my own brother suffer just to hoard money for myself. My father cleared his throat and muttered that families should support each other. His voice low, but his eyes sharp with expectation. I realized with a sickening drop in my stomach that they had already discussed this without me already decided that my sacrifice was the solution. But I did not bend. For the first time, I looked Daniel in the eye and said, "I am not responsible for your choices. If you want money for a vacation or for your debts, then work for it." The silence that followed was not just uncomfortable, it was electric, filled with rage waiting to burst. My mother's glare was sharp enough to slice through me. My father's disappointment radiated like heat. Daniel's eyes glittered with fury, a storm I knew too well. He leaned across the table and hissed that I would regret this. My hands trembled, but I did not look away. I pushed back my chair and left the table without another word, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. That night, as I lay in the small bed of my childhood room, I replayed the scene again and again. The venom in his voice, the look on my parents' faces, the weight of their disapproval pressed on my chest until I could hardly breathe. something inside me shifted. I had always known they favored him, always known I was expendable in their eyes, but this time was different. This time I had drawn a line, and in their world lines were not allowed. When I packed to return to campus the next day, Daniel appeared in the doorway. His arms were crossed, his expression cold. "You think you are stronger now," he said softly. "You think you can stand against me. You will see Rachel. You will see what happens when you do not give me what I want." His words settled over me like a curse. I tried to brush them off as empty threats, but deep down I felt the tremor of something darker, something that would not stop at words. The night it happened began quietly on the surface, yet I could feel the tension humming beneath every sound. I was home again, foolishly hoping that a few days under the same roof would not erupt into chaos, but Daniel had not forgotten the humiliation of my refusal. The house was still, except for the ticking of the hallway clock. I sat at my desk, reviewing notes, the lamp casting a small circle of light across my books. Then the door slammed open so violently that the frame shuddered. Daniel stormed in, his face red with fury, his hair damp with sweat, his breathing ragged like a man who had spent hours working himself into a frenzy. He said nothing at first. He only advanced, eyes gleaming with something unhinged. In his hand, he carried a look of purpose more dangerous than any weapon. I pushed back my chair, startled, clutching my notebook to my chest as though it could shield me. He lunged and grabbed my wrist, wrenching my hand outward. Before I could process what was happening, he bent my finger back with brutal precision. The snap was sickening, sharp, and final. Pain detonated through my arm, white-hot and searing. I screamed a ragged sound that shook the walls, but he only laughed low and dark. He said I had humiliated him, that I had disrespected him, that I needed to be taught a lesson I would never forget. He bent the next finger, slowly savoring the crack as it broke. I howled, tears blurring my vision, my knees buckling. He shoved me down to the carpet, pinning my shoulder with his knee, stretching my arm out so my hand was exposed. He hissed that I would never hold a pen again, never cradle a child, never touch my dreams. Then came the third finger, and I nearly lost consciousness from the blast of pain that consumed me. My body thrashed my free hand, clawing at the floor nails, ripping until blood smeared across the boards. My cries grew hoarse, breaking into sobs that rattled my ribs. Daniel leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear, telling me that no one would save me, that our parents would believe him as they always had. He bent the fourth finger with deliberate cruelty. The crunch echoed in my skull. My vision darkened at the edges, and I felt myself drifting. A voice inside screamed that if I let go now, he would finish me, that he would not stop until I was ruined. Summoning the last shred of strength, I kicked violently, my heel connecting with the wooden dresser. The crash was thunderous, the furniture shuddering. The noise jolted Daniel for a heartbeat, just enough for me to gasp a shred of air. He snarled and slammed me harder against the floor, raising his hand to snap my thumb. My body shook with terror, but also with the desperate spark of survival. I twisted, flailing my elbow connecting with his chest. He cursed, and for an instant his balance faltered. I scrambled, dragging myself toward the desk, but he was on me again, pressing his weight down, wrenching my wrist back. He spat that I was nothing that I would regret ever standing against him. The smell of sweat and dust filled my nose as my face pressed into the carpet. The pounding in my skull nearly drowned out the world, but I heard footsteps from outside, voices calling faintly. The dresser crash had carried through the walls. Panic flickered across Daniel's face. He released me for a moment, then, in a grotesque act of deception, he raked his nails down his own arm to raise welts. He collapsed beside me, clutching his skin, howling that I had attacked him. My parents burst into the room, their eyes darting first to him, trembling and weeping, then to me, crumpled on the floor with my grotesquely twisted hand. I tried to speak, my voice shredded into rasps, but no words formed. My mother rushed to Daniel's side, gathering him into her arms, crying that her poor boy had been attacked. My father glared at me with fury, muttering that I was a disgrace, that I would never stop causing trouble. Daniel looked over my mother's shoulder, his lips curled into a victorious smirk, meant only for me. I gasped, clutching my ruined hand to my chest, tears streaking down my face. The room spun as my father ordered me to leave, his voice cold with disgust. My cries of pain were swallowed in the air, ignored, dismissed. My parents fussed over him while I staggered toward the hall, every nerve screaming. My body shook, my breath ragged, but inside a spark of clarity burned. He might have broken my fingers, but he had not broken the truth. And I would find a way to make that truth heard. That night, as I collapsed onto the bed, my hand throbbing with every heartbeat, I knew survival meant more than enduring. It meant gathering the proof carved into my bones and waiting for the moment it would be revealed. When morning came, the agony in my hand had swollen into something monstrous. Each finger throbbed with its own pulse, my skin stretched purple and blue, the shape of my hand grotesque. I could barely move, but beneath the pain burned a cold determination. Daniel thought he had won by twisting reality in front of our parents, but bones did not lie. X-rays would speak louder than his tears. I wrapped my injured hand in a scarf, every movement dragging fire through my nerves, and told my parents I needed to see a doctor. My mother scoffed, saying I was being dramatic. My father muttered that we could not afford to waste money on nonsense when Daniel clearly needed attention. Daniel sat smugly on the couch, his arm bandaged with theatrical exaggeration, telling me to stop making things worse. But I refused to yield. I called David, my partner, and with shaking breath explained enough for him to rush over. When he arrived and saw my hand, his face paled. Without hesitation, he drove me to the hospital, ignoring my parents' protests. The emergency room lights were harsh, the antiseptic air cold, but for the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of safety. Nurses gasped when I unwrapped the scarf and revealed the damage. They moved quickly, ushering me into radiology, the whir of machines buzzing around me. As the technician positioned my hand, I clenched my teeth so hard I thought they might crack every adjustment, ripping another scream from my throat. The machine clicked and whirred, capturing the truth that my family refused to see. When the images appeared on the screen, the evidence was undeniable. 4 fingers fractured clean through jagged lines like lightning bolts across the bones, swelling, pressing against the brakes. The doctor's voice was steady but grave as he explained the extent of the injuries. This was not an accident. This was deliberate force applied with cruelty. My stomach churned, but my heart steadied. Here was the weapon Daniel could not twist into lies. David squeezed my shoulder, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with rage on my behalf. He whispered that we would make sure this was not hidden. He insisted we file a report immediately. Part of me trembled at the thought of exposing the truth, of turning family into a battlefield that could never be repaired, but another part of me remembered Daniel's smirk as he mouthed that I deserved it. That memory hardened me. I agreed. The officer who arrived took one look at my mangled hand, and his professional mask barely held. He asked questions, and for once I spoke without flinching. I described how Daniel cornered me, how he bent each finger, how he whispered threats. Every word shook with pain, but also with conviction. When the officer glanced at David and asked if I had support, David declared firmly that he would testify to everything he had seen and heard since. A report was filed, the evidence documented, the photograph sealed. As I signed the papers, my bandaged hand trembled, but not with fear, with a sense of finally being heard. Returning home later that day was another ordeal. My parents were waiting, their faces twisted with fury. They accused me of destroying the family, of betraying blood. My mother wailed that Daniel's reputation would be ruined, that I had gone too far. My father spat that I was vengeful and cold. Through it all, Daniel sat silent, his eyes narrowing with something darker than rage, a recognition that his control was slipping. I did not argue. I did not beg for them to see. Instead, I raised my bandaged hand, the stark white wrap, a flag of both suffering and defiance, and told them simply that the truth was now beyond their denial. They shouted, but the words rolled off me. bones do not lie," I repeated quietly to myself. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of years pressing down, but beneath it was a new strength rising. The fractures hurt with every heartbeat, but they were also proof carved into my body. Proof that one day soon, in a courtroom filled with strangers, the truth would be undeniable and Daniel would finally face the consequence of every cruel act he thought he had hidden. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and dust, its high ceilings amplifying every shuffle of shoes and cough of strangers. As I walked through the double doors, my heart hammered so loudly I thought the bailiff might call it to order before the judge even entered. My hand was bound in rigid splints, each finger encased the bulky bandages stark against my dark jacket. Every step was agony not only from the fractures, but from the memories replaying like a cruel film in my mind. David walked beside me steady and calm, his presence a tether keeping me from floating into panic. My parents were already inside, seated close to Daniel. My mother stroked his shoulder, whispering reassurances, while my father's jaw was clenched in grim determination. Daniel himself wore a mask of false fragility, his arms still bandaged with exaggerated drama, his eyes lowered as though he were the victim of unspeakable torment. When he saw me enter, his lips curled for just a second into the same smirk he had given me the night he broke me. I inhaled slowly, clenching my good fist, reminding myself that this time the stage belonged to truth, not manipulation. The judge arrived, the murmurs died, and the trial began. Lawyers spoke words flying like darts across the silent courtroom, but I barely heard them until the moment came for the evidence. The prosecutor called the radiologist, and the room seemed to shrink as the technician wheeled in the illuminated screen. When the first X-ray image flashed to life, I felt my breath catch. There, on the glowing board, were my bones, stark black and white lines etched with violent fractures. 4 fingers broken clean through each snap, a jagged scar on the image. Gasps rippled through the benches as the technician pointed to the brakes and explained the force required the impossibility of accident. Every detail was laid bare in scientific certainty. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tightening, his face paling under the weight of undeniable truth. My mother clutched his arm tighter, whispering that it was unfair, but the jurors leaned forward with narrowed eyes. The doctor followed, speaking calmly but firmly, describing how the injuries could not have been self-inflicted, how they were consistent with deliberate external force. His words sliced through the air, sharper than any blade dismantling the lies my brother had spun. My parents squirmed, their confidence faltering. Then it was my turn. My knees trembled as I rose, but David's hand pressed gently against my back, urging me forward. I swore the oath, my voice unsteady but audible, and began to speak. I told them how Daniel stormed into my room, how he pinned me, how each finger snapped one by one while he whispered that I deserved it. I described the smell of sweat, the sound of bones cracking, the mocking tone of his voice. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to break. Every sentence was a stone laid on the path toward freedom. The defense tried to rattle me, suggesting I had exaggerated, that I had a history of jealousy. They even hinted that perhaps the injuries had been accidental. But then the prosecutor displayed the photographs taken that night, my hand grotesque and swollen beyond recognition. The jurors flinched, some covering their mouths. The defense faltered, their questions dwindling into silence. When I stepped down, I caught Daniel's eyes. For the first time, they lacked certainty. He looked small, cornered, his performance unraveling. Days stretched as testimonies piled, but each moment pushed the truth further into light. Witnesses spoke of Daniel's temper, of his past outbursts. David testified about my call, my collapse into his car, my screams in the emergency room. Even the neighbors admitted they had heard the crash and my cries through the walls. Piece by piece, the web he wove collapsed. The climax came when the prosecutor replayed my brother's own contradictions. They projected his earlier statements side by side, showing how he had changed details to suit his narrative. The jurors exchanged glances, suspicion turning into certainty. Finally, closing arguments rang through the chamber, words about cruelty, betrayal, and accountability. The prosecutor's voice soared, declaring that family does not grant immunity to violence, that blood does not excuse broken bones. The defense sputtered about loyalty and misunderstandings, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The jury left the room heavy with silence. My heart thudded in my throat as minutes stretched like hours. Then they returned faces solemn. The foreman stood papers trembling slightly in his hands and delivered the words that shattered years of silence. Guilty on all counts. The sound rang like a bell inside me, reverberating through my bones. My mother wailed, clutching Daniel as though he were the true victim. My father muttered curses under his breath, glaring at me with a hatred that could no longer wound me. Daniel's face crumpled, his body shaking as guards approached. He shouted that I had ruined him, that I had betrayed him, but the words bounced off walls of justice that no longer bent to his lies. As they led him away, he stumbled, collapsing to his knees, when the final X-ray was held up once more for the record. The sight of his victim's bones displayed publicly was more than his mask could endure. He broke down, sobbing, his arrogance dissolved into pathetic ruin. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, some in shock, some in grim satisfaction. I sat, frozen tears streaming freely, not from sorrow, but from release. For once, the truth was not buried, not silenced, not dismissed. It stood in the open, undeniable, and fierce. I looked at my bandaged hand and for the first time felt its brokenness. As a symbol of survival, a testament carved into my body that lies cannot erase. As we left the courthouse into the bright sunlight, David wrapped his arm around me. The air smelled cleaner, the sky wider, as though the world itself recognized the shift. Justice had spoken. The cost was immense, but silence had finally been broken. The verdict did not end the story, but it rewrote the shape of our family forever. In the days that followed Daniel's sentencing, the silence in my parents' house grew heavier than any scream. My mother stopped answering my calls, though most of the time I did not bother to dial. When she did pick up, her words were short and sharp, accusing me of destroying the family, of betraying the blood that raised me. My father sent a single message, 3 sentences typed, like a final curse: "You chose strangers over us. You humiliated your brother. You are no longer welcome here." Reading it, I felt the cut of finality, yet also the strange lightness of being freed from chains I had worn too long. Daniel was led away to serve his sentence, and reports in the local paper framed him not as the victim he pretended to be, but as the man who broke his sister's hand, bone by bone. Neighbors whispered, co-workers judged, and his friends who once indulged him scattered into shadows. The mask he had worn his whole life cracked in public, and beneath it was nothing but rot. My parents clung to denial, spinning stories about injustice, telling relatives that the system had failed, but photographs of my swollen hand and the clear lines of the X-rays traveled further than their excuses. There was no hiding now. I began to hear from cousins I had not spoken to in years. Some reached out with tentative sympathy, saying they had always suspected something was wrong. Others admitted they had turned away before, out of fear of becoming targets themselves. Their words were small, but they stitched threads of connection where there had only been silence. At the hospital where I continued therapy, doctors marveled at my progress. The splints were removed one by one, my fingers stiff and aching, but every tiny movement was a victory. Pain accompanied me like a shadow, yet it no longer controlled me. Each session of physical therapy was a reminder that healing was not just physical, but also proof of resilience. David remained constant, his patience a balm. He never flinched when I cried in frustration over my stiff fingers, or when nightmares woke me with screams echoing from the past. Instead, he held me until my shaking calmed and reminded me that survival itself was defiance. Slowly, I returned to my studies, my professors accommodating, my classmates curious but respectful. When they asked what happened, I told them in simple words. My brother broke my fingers, and the truth broke his lies. The clarity of that sentence silenced pity and replaced it with respect. The most powerful shift came inside myself. For years, I had carried the weight of being dismissed, of being told my pain was imaginary, of being branded the difficult one. Now the proof was public, and the narrative no longer belonged to Daniel or my parents. It belonged to me. I spoke to support groups, sharing my story with others trapped in cycles of family violence, and I watched as their eyes lit with recognition. My broken hand became a symbol not of defeat, but of resistance. The fractures had healed into scars that whispered of endurance and justice. My parents never came to visit, not once. On holidays, I saw their house dark in my memory, but the warmth of chosen family replaced what I had lost. Friends gathered around me. David's family welcomed me as their own, and in that embrace, I discovered what family was meant to be: love without conditions, support without manipulation. The cost of truth had been high. I lost the illusion of parents. I lost the brother I once protected as a child. Yet in return, I gained freedom, dignity, and the strength to know that silence would never again be my cage. Daniel's name became a warning whispered in courtrooms and community meetings, a reminder that abuse hidden in plain sight can finally be dragged into light. My story spread further than I expected, newspapers citing it in articles about domestic violence, advocates referencing the trial as proof that family loyalty should never outweigh justice. I did not seek fame, but I accepted the weight of responsibility. If my suffering could prevent another, then even the pain had meaning. Standing in front of a small audience at a local center one evening, I lifted my hand into the air, scars visible under the bright lights, and said with steady voice, "These fingers were broken to silence me, but they healed to write the truth." The room erupted in applause, and I felt tears burn my eyes, not of sorrow, but of triumph. The years that followed did not erase the pain, but they transformed it into something I could carry without crumbling. Each time I looked at my hand, I no longer saw only the night of violence, but also the trial, the truth, and the strength it took to fight. The scars across my knuckles remained faint reminders, pale lines against my skin that whispered of battles survived. I finished my degree, at last, the pen feeling awkward in my stiff fingers, yet more precious than ever. Every essay, every signed paper was an act of rebellion against the brother who swore I would never write again. David and I built a life together, not free of hardship, but free of chains. In our home, laughter replaced screams, trust replaced suspicion, and love was something given without conditions. There were nights when I woke in terror, hearing phantom cracks of bone in my dreams, but he was always there to remind me that the past could not reach me here. My parents faded from my world like ghosts that had never truly loved me. I heard through distant relatives that they moved away quietly, ashamed of whispers in the neighborhood clinging to the story that I was cruel. At first, the thought stung, but then it softened into indifference. You cannot lose what you never truly had. Daniel remained behind bars, his appeals denied his name, etched into court records as a warning of what unchecked cruelty becomes. Sometimes I imagined him staring at the same four walls, replaying the moment his lies collapsed under the glow of X-rays, but I did not waste my life waiting for his regret. Justice had already been delivered. My task was to live. I began speaking more often at support groups and schools, my voice steadier with each retelling. Women clasped my hand, men wiped tears, young people whispered that they saw their own families in mine. Every time I told the story, I felt the weight lighten, not because the pain diminished, but because it was shared. No longer a secret festering in silence, it became a torch to guide others. I learned that survival is not only personal, but collective. The more we speak, the less darkness can thrive. Years later, when I stood at a podium at a statewide conference on domestic violence, the applause echoed through a hall packed with hundreds. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, but I looked only at the faces in the crowd, faces hungry for truth, faces who knew the cost of silence. I raised my hand again, scarred yet steady, and said, "These fingers were broken to chain me, but they healed to free me." The room rose to its feet, the roar of applause rolling like thunder. In that moment, I understood that my story no longer belonged just to me. It was carried by every person who refused to stay silent, by every survivor who turned scars into weapons of truth. I stepped away from the podium with a calm heart. The journey that began with shattered bones had led me to a place of unshakable clarity. My brother's violence was not the end of me. My parents' betrayal was not the definition of me. What defined me was the choice to fight, to speak, to live without fear. The past would always exist, but it no longer held the power to control my future. My hand, once broken finger by finger, now rested easily at my side as I walked off stage into the embrace of people who saw me not as damaged, but as whole. The story was mine, the ending was mine, and the legacy would echo long after I was gone. If you are listening to my story and something inside you aches with recognition, then I want you to hear me clearly. You are not alone and you are not powerless. I know the weight of silence. I know the way family can twist loyalty into chains. I know the fear of speaking out when everyone tells you to stay quiet, but I also know the moment when truth breaks through and the air feels clean for the first time. It is terrifying and it is painful, but it is also the beginning of freedom. If my brother could shatter my fingers one by one, and yet I can still write these words today, then you too can take the first step toward reclaiming your life. The scars we carry do not have to remain symbols of defeat. They can become the proof of survival, the maps that lead others out of the dark. I urge you, if someone you trust is hurting you, do not wait for them to stop, because they will not seek out the people who will listen. Call the hotlines, reach for the friends who believe you tell the doctors, show the truth in whatever way you can. The evidence of your pain is not shameful. It is powerful. It is the key that opens the door to justice. I know the fear of losing family. I know the sting of being called a betrayer. But what I gained when I chose truth was far greater. I gained freedom. I gained peace. I gained the knowledge that I will never again bow to cruelty. And that gift is waiting for you, too, when you decide that your safety, your dignity, your life matters more than their lies. If my story has moved you, then share it. Let it echo further than this room, than this screen. Share it with the woman who whispers her bruises into the dark. Share it with the man who hides his scars under long sleeves. Share it with the child who believes silence is safer than truth. Let them know that bones may break, but lies cannot last forever. Justice is not a dream, it is a fight, and every voice adds weight to the scales. Together, we can shatter the silence. Together, we can break the cycle. If you are standing at the edge, wondering whether you are strong enough, believe me, you are. I was once curled on the floor with a broken hand, convinced I had no power left. But here I am, scars turned into strength, words turned into weapons, and silence turned into thunder. So take my hand, even if it trembles, know that I am reaching back for you. You are not alone, and the moment you choose to speak is the moment the world begins to change.